have a great panel for you all today. Marina, Lily, Caroline, Urszula, please come on up. We have experts from around the world who are going to help us learn about what's going on from a policy standpoint. What are the policymakers and regulators thinking about all around the world? With that, I will take a seat, and you guys are going to have to do an EHA again at the end of our panel, just so that you are prepared. Caroline, why don't we start with you? Everybody introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off some questions.
Great, thanks a lot, Lee. It's great to be here. So Caroline Malcolm, I've been working in the space for about 8 years, always on the policy side, first at the OECD and most recently at Chainalysis, where I ran the public policy function.
Hey everybody, Urszula McCormack. I work in private practice. I'm based in Sydney with a team in Australia and in Hong Kong. People like the Bank for International Settlements around blockchain platforms and the ins and outs of doing those.
Hi, my name is Lilya Tessler. I'm a partner and head of Sidley Austin's FinTech and Blockchain practice. And day to day, I help clients navigate the complex US and cross-border regulatory issues related to blockchain products and services, as well as helping them launch compliant products and services on a global scale.
Hello everyone, my name is Marina, and I'm the CEO of the European Crypto Initiative, which is an advocacy organization based in Brussels. I've been working in this space for the last 7 years as well. I was mostly working with projects, doing advisory, but when MiCA, as you may have heard, the Markezic crypto assets regulation have kicked in, we have started working on policy, so that's where we do today.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for coming all the way to Buenos Aires. To kick things off, let's talk about tokenization of assets. We heard a lot about that when Gun was talking, when John was talking. How sort of is the world looking at tokenization of assets? Marina, why don't we start with you for the European perspective?
Okay, there's a lot happening in Europe. So Europe has been very early in starting thinking about what blockchain means and what it could bring to the EU, in a way, community, to the EU industry. And they have started first with what I mentioned, the markets and crypto assets regulation, but why we are here today is to talk about tokenization. So there's another very interesting project, and it's called the DLT pilot regime, that was really focused on basically tokenizing securities, and that's where I think the EU was really, like, in a way, looking ahead, trying to think about what can we do, how can we facilitate securities, financial instruments to be traded and settled on the DLT. So the DLT pilot regime for now is more of a, similar to a sandbox, is a temporary pilot regime. It goes on for 3 years. And unfortunately, we did not have a lot of success with it. What I mean is there are not a lot of projects in Europe that are, in a way, regulated under the DLT pilot regime, although it's already possible, and they're not registered under that. And there are a few problems with it. Maybe we can go into that later. But what I think it's positive still is that everyone, the European Commission, Parliament, everyone in Brussels, but also all national competent authorities, they have started thinking about the DLT pilot regime. They start thinking about tokenization, and I think that we had a lot of learnings, and I think that hopefully the pilot regime will be extended, and we'll also see more projects working within this pilot regime.
Great, thank you, Marina. Lily, let's chat a little bit about the US, which can be problematic, as everybody knows.
Yes, definitely happy to talk about the US tokenization regime, which there really is none. Really what you need to start with is what is the asset being tokenized, and depending on the asset being tokenized, there's a whole line of regulations, legislation, depending on what industry that asset is in, that may or may not apply, or may not even take tokenization consideration yet, and may require further development and guidance. So I think it's important to think about that asset, and there could be overlapping regulations, which is where some of the challenges may lie, as well as certain regulators take the view, the SEC being one of them, that everything is a financial instrument, a financial product, which is not necessarily the case when you're tokenizing assets. So those are also important things to think about. Just from a policy perspective, this is definitely a hot topic in Washington from a regulatory perspective. I myself participated in a congressional hearing that we had regarding tokenization of real-world assets. So we're starting to see regulators and legislature thinking about, do we need to have the existing regulations be modified, adopted? Do we need to have guidance on how you can use blockchain, tokenize different types of assets within the existing regulation? So it's kind of a myriad of overlapping regulations that we're going to see and develop over time.
Urszula, I'm not going to ask you to cover all of APAC, since that would be way too much, but give us a few highlights from some key jurisdictions.
Yeah, look, absolutely. So the wonder of APAC is you see the full gamut. So tokenizing any sort of asset, mainland China, that demonstrates the hardest position. You can't do it, can't sell it, nothing. Then we've got sort of the other end of the spectrum, no guidance, nothing, a lot of uncertainty, places like Vietnam. And then in the middle, you've got major markets like Hong Kong and Singapore in particular, providing a lot of guidance in terms of what are the technical standards we would expect of you to tokenize an asset. And when I say guidance, I generally mean guidance from financial regulators. They're the most active. They will provide their prescriptive requirements to the people they regulate. So it would be the intermediaries who are selling, who are structuring. So in that arena, there's a lot of really great pathways, guidance, information that provides a lot of confidence to the market, either to experiment themselves or at least to support the industry as a bank, as an intermediary. So that's a really positive thing. In certain cases, we see some level of pruning that occurs in that instance, but I couldn't emphasize enough for Lily's point, which is that it all matters, the fundamentals matter. So where we've had some really positive experimentation, like the tokenization of gold, it was an HSBC product that was launched earlier this year. That was a fractional interest in a real gold bar sitting in its London vaults. But because it was a fractional interest, it wasn't a one-to-one with the exact full gold bar. It was a collective investment scheme, so it had to go down a regulatory pathway. I can, of course, create something that's not an instrument like that, but it's a different story. So the combination of clear guidance, some pruning, but also experimentation closely with regulators is where we're headed. The only final thing I'll mention that's different to what we're seeing in Europe is we're not yet seeing the sort of statutory legal clarity around, the recognition of that digital twin of the real world asset. So that's still missing.
Caroline, what are the sort of global international groups like the OECD, IOSCO, and others thinking about tokenization of assets?
So that's a good question. I might touch briefly on the Middle East, and then because I think the Middle East gets a lot of attention when we think about what I think called like the sort of the pure crypto space versus sort of the tokenized asset space, which can be our real world assets versus our sort of digital native assets. And across the Middle East, you have an interesting sort of bifurcation. You have those jurisdictions which have created regimes for that sort of pure crypto world. Your VARAs, ADGM, for example, in the UAE, and then you have, and Bahrain, but then you have other jurisdictions, and I'm thinking here about Qatar and even in Saudi, who seem to be a little bit more comfortable thinking more about the tokenized world than they do about the pure crypto world. So just, at a high level. The other thing I think I sort of see kind of globally is, still very uneven in terms of the approach. And when we think about those international bodies, I guess as a whole, their focus has been a lot more on that pure crypto space, but we are starting to see some interest, and I think kind of we don't often think about it when we talk about tokenization, but we think, but things like stablecoins, right, and a sort of tokenization of effectively money market funds is where there is a lot more interest and a lot more actually happening. I think that's where regulators, and you've seen them focus a lot more on that space than the broader, say, tokenization of what we might think of as a financial asset. And I just want to add one more thing to sort of, and I know it's probably a subject close to your heart, Lee, but this idea that, when you tokenize something, it doesn't in of itself make it a financial asset, and the session before really kind of listening to that conversation really brought that home. And I think that is another conversation we are not really seeing happening, but I would really encourage everyone to have more, which is that there is a spectrum of, even within what we might call financial assets, there's a whole sort of broad spectrum of what they are, and they don't necessarily all need the same rules. But beyond that, I think the risk that when you're, and I see this when I talk to regulators, say, in certain parts of the world, is that they talk about things like gaming and the tokens that you can have within the gaming ecosystem. And they're like, well, yeah, I mean, those should be subject to rules as well. I was like, whoa, like we've never done that. We've never had gaming subject to regulation in the same way we do finance. And for a whole bunch of sort of philosophical reasons about why that's the case. And I think we do need to kind of be alert to this risk that there is a sort of a slippery slope that as soon as you tokenize, oh wow, now that falls within the kind of remit of the financial markets regulators. And kind of developing where we think those lines should be, I think, is something that is to come for the industry.
So thank you, Caroline. I'm going to make a shameless plug now based on what you said for our Owl Explains project. And by the way, we have a cool Owl Explains space right under the stairs downstairs, so make sure you go check us out there. Owl Explains is a project that we implemented to try to explain these things to regulators and policymakers, because we have a strong belief that they don't understand what tokenization of assets means. They don't understand the concept that you can digitally represent something, anything, on a blockchain, and that doesn't change the nature of that asset. So we have a great podcast series, and we're working with academics, lots of cool stuff, if I do say so myself. So please check it out. And Sylvia Sanchez, who runs that project, is somewhere around here the next couple days, so definitely find her and say hello. So Urszula, you chatted a little bit about the gold bars. I know there's been other people who focused on that. So Lily, did you want to talk a little bit about that first?
Yeah, so happy to. So I've worked on projects for tokenization of a lot of different type of assets, tokenized gold being one of them. I just wanted to briefly talk about the importance of thinking through what is the nature of the asset first. So first, what you're tokenizing is actual gold, a bar of gold. So that has certain regulations from a US perspective. Gold is a commodity, so commodities laws apply if you're offering or selling it in the United States, as well as certain other regulations regarding trading venues that may be trading these assets. Tokenizing that asset shouldn't change the regulations around it. However, there are certainly considerations as to whether securities laws apply that are also subject to SEC regulation if you are selling security interests in the gold rather than the actual bar of gold itself. So that's a consideration. But also, often overlooked is commercial laws. How do you actually transfer ownership of the asset on chain? In the US, there are US uniform commercial laws that are different in every state in the United States. So depending where you're offering or how you're transferring ownership in a state, that may vary. It becomes even more complex where much of the gold is bought and sold in the London Bullion Exchange. It may be custodied in other countries, but you're transferring in the US. So what laws apply? Is the foreign jurisdictions, ownership laws, the US regulations? So there's a lot of interesting kind of legal issues to consider on something as simple as tokenizing gold bars and selling them and trading them. So that's one example, but we're seeing tokenization in a lot of different areas. It's much easier to tokenize security interests because the laws in the US already exist with respect to securities laws. So we're seeing tokenization of funds interests, tokenization of equity, bonds, and so forth, because the laws exist. But interesting other creative projects where there is no guidance is a way to need to think through some of these implications.
Marina, I know you mentioned MiCA. Is MiCA thinking about these issues yet, or they're really waiting to see what happens and they'll deal with it later like they're going to deal with DeFi later?
I love the question. So basically, there's a theory that the first very successful tokenized asset are stablecoins, and those are the heart of the MiCA regulation. That's why we have MiCA mostly. And if we think about, they are regulated in a very specific way. We have certain requirements, etc. As you know, we already had few licenses issued, and there are regulated stablecoins in Europe already as of July 2024. So that's in a way regulated. Then we have MiCA mostly regulates crypto assets, which we in Europe mostly agreed that the tokens that we now use and see are crypto assets and not securities, not financial instruments. We'll still have a lot of debate, I think, with the national competent authorities in the next weeks and months, but in general, they are not securities. So this kind of group of assets, they're not securities, exists out there. And then we have NFTs that are also mentioned in MiCA. And with NFTs, it's pretty, I would say, complicated, because if they're not unique and if the issue is not small, so that still we need to look into what that exactly means and what are the interpretation. Is the, 100 NFTs small enough? Is something that is, 100,000? Would that be too big of an issue to be an NFT? But when it comes to NFTs in general, they could be three different things. They can be NFTs from a legal point of view, so excluded from MiCA and not regulated. That could be crypto assets and regulated by MiCA, so mostly writing a white paper when issuing, listing, etc. Or they could be financial instruments. And it really goes back to what we were saying, what is really the core of the tokenized assets. So the Liechtenstein regulator years ago, they mentioned a container. That's a really nice metaphor. So the regulator doesn't care that much about a container, but what is in it. And we have these different assets right now, and I think quite a lot of clarity in Europe when it comes to that. What I mentioned before, the DLT pilot regime is for financial instruments, but to a certain amount. So for example, when it comes to shares, there's a limitation of 500 million. When it comes to bonds, public or private, 200 million, etc. So it's really for smaller projects. And the European Commission at the moment is still looking into and trying to understand more if they should do something more when it comes to, in a way, unlimited issuance of financial instruments on the DLT pilot regime. So very, very active. There's a lot of things happening in the EU, and I think tokenization is really going to be something that is going to be pretty important for the new commission. As you know, we have a new commission, a new parliament, so for the next 5 years, that is really going to be one of the important topics.
Urszula, Caroline, please weigh in here too.
I was only going to, I wanted to raise some of the other areas and themes that might be relevant to developers. And, I'll pick Australia as an example, is that there is a stronger focus on the responsibilities of technology developers and providers. Everything from doing something with the information they have about the activity that's occurring using their technology and potentially ascribing liability for that. So a great example is just with fraud and scams and people losing a lot, tricked to losing a lot of their money. Banks now sick of paying out on all of that and really attention focusing on platforms. But also with banks that are issuing stablecoins, they're worried about the information that they see, and with the technological, the technical functions that they have to potentially intermediate and disrupt those transactions, or even just to see them. The more you see, the more you need to do with that information. And so that makes a lot of banks nervous about launching that sort of infrastructure where they're able to see, intervene, and they need to do something about it. But the other thing I wanted to mention, given that there's a focus here on that there are a number of people building gaming platforms and social components, is that there's also a really strong focus on the design aspects of technology that really push and encourage people to interact. And what I mean by that are the addictive style, sort of functionalities and mechanisms that really hook people in, that have really been there in the background but haven't had regulatory focus. And then the second are things like dark patterns that sort of nudge people to make certain choices as well. So as much as there's a real drive to get as much engagement as possible, I would keep an eye out on that as a developer. Finally, just briefly, is also age restrictions as well.
No, look, I think you're right, Urszula, and I don't think people are paying enough attention to the changing sort of conversation and ultimately sort of regulatory or enforcement action around the responsibilities of platforms. And I think, if we think of sort of the financial world being down sort of this end of the spectrum, and sort of historically the sort of social and sort of communication networks have been down this other end of the spectrum in terms of sort of the degree of scrutiny that they've been allowed to be sort of subject to. I think that's very, very much changing. And as I said, I think there is a sort of a social demand that changes, and Gun was just talking about, sort of creating the world that we want to see in terms of this sort of Web3, this decentralized sort of space, and more opportunities for users and creators in that. But that also then, means that there are, more obligations on those people is what we can sort of foresee coming, but it won't just sit with the platforms, which is where we're sort of moving to now, but ultimately in a sort of a Web3 world that you can see some of those obligations that the users or creators themselves may either have to think about in their own development and design, or actually when they're considering which platforms to sort of make their, products and tools available on, whether those are actually compliant as well. That kind of shifting liability is sort of definitely, I think, something which we are seeing increasingly occur.
And can I just briefly, because you mentioned earlier that discussion around the sort of game tokens and, being careful around the boundaries. One of the discussions we sometimes have with tax authorities, they say, yeah, well, we didn't care before, but now we've got a lot of people making a lot of money from this ecosystem, and so from a policy perspective, our approach does need to change.
Yeah, no, it is true. It's quite interesting. So my background is as a tax lawyer, and I got into the crypto space through tax for my sins. And what was really interesting is that it was that point at where the sort of market really picked up that you did see a shift. So there's some risks that come with becoming successful, I think, in terms of you draw more attention, both in terms of the number of people you're touching, but also the volumes that are actually taking place.
And I agree that crypto and blockchain is sort of highlighting issues that have already been there, but for whatever reason, tax authorities, regulators, and others have not been paying as close attention. But now that there's blockchain, now that there's crypto, all of a sudden they feel like they have to pay a lot of attention to those areas. And I think those areas are overlooked in the conversation about tokenization of assets, right? So thinking about, I hate to go back to the taxation, although maybe Caroline will enjoy that. But now we spend a huge amount of time thinking about the taxation issues associated with everything related to blockchain and crypto. And the last point that I'll make, and then please others jump in, is because everything is so global, right? We're seeing all of these issues play out in different ways, in different countries, at different time, at different speeds. And so it makes it even more difficult to sort of be able to say, okay, I know what the answer is, let's just do that.
Maybe I'll go into that first. In a way, blockchain and the industry was global from day one. And right now we are focusing and we need to look into each jurisdiction specifically. And as you say, they're not developing at the same time. So we need to be having a license already if you are a stablecoin issuer in Europe, but there's no regulation yet in the US or somewhere else. So basically, by default, it makes a project in a way, it forces a project to have different products for different jurisdictions, and that also increases, of course, the cost of compliance, etc. But it really means that you are going to be, in a way, having a different product in each jurisdiction. And what I wanted to mention before, and what you went into, platform regulation is also something that is happening in the EU, the Digital Marketing Act, the Digital Services Act. There's, I don't think the crypto maybe industry has paid enough attention on that, because it was mostly on the kind of a content creator platforms, etc. But it is also applicable for all the platforms that we, in a way, are working on here. And the other topic is, in Europe, we have the first definition of a smart contract already in a regulation that is regulating data, but in a way, it is something that we have have right now as a first definition and first standards if you want to use a smart contract in certain instances connected to data that is coming from IoT devices. So very specific, but it really just shows that this kind of responsibility when it comes to developers, regulating, looking into smart contracts. So the core of what we're building here is going to be also something that we're going to be debating in Europe as well.
Lily, just before you jump in, I do want to emphasize a point that I think you've all made, which is about the amount of data and information that's now available, about the insight you can get from looking at the platforms. And that, to a lot of us, is heightening the need for privacy-preserving technologies. And a very good friend of mine from Portugal, a law professor there, thinks that that's the next big issue that we all need to be tackling. Sorry, Lily.
So I just wanted to piggyback off of what Marina said, and I think it's really important. There's many developers here that think about, interchain operability or cross-chain interoperability across, whether it's different Avalanche chains or across different blockchains, but thinking about interoperability across jurisdictions and being able to program that on-chain is, I think, often overlooked technology development in process or in the process developing technology and should be considered. Maybe there's potentially a way for technology tools and compliance tools to be able to be created to allow for the same tokenized product to move across jurisdictions with it still retaining some of the same characteristics. Because, as Marina said, you might need to be building different products for different countries, but ideally, a blockchain, you want to be able to have the same asset across different countries being able to be moved instantaneously, and without those compliance tools, given the different regulatory regimes, that may not be possible. So just something to think about as people are developing different tokenized assets.
I'll add that it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the law. It's very easy to get stuck. It's very easy to have bad advisors who will just tell you it's very complicated. What I would say is that there's a huge amount of opportunity in what's happening on the legal and the regulatory side, and that's from various angles, both to solve legal challenges like privacy-preserving technologies is a great example. On-chain analytics, what another great example that's solving a regulatory problem. But also through the need that regulators have, things around that sound a bit boring from time to time, but like audit of smart contracts, of attestation and certifications of certain custody technology. That's really opening up quite a lot of opportunity for developers to support those who don't know, who can't develop themselves, but in a way that's going to be consistent with the real world in which they'll need to operate.
Yeah, I think that we're going to see, more and more being built in that RegTech, regulatory technology space, just because you are having this shift of power, which has many advantages, and I think particularly sort of for the creator community, but it does also come with these obligations, so making sure that those people have the tools so that what they're building, they don't, they're not particularly, I'm sure, interested in, ensuring the finer points of compliance with different sort of regulatory obligations around the world, but they do want to access those markets. So people building tools for those creators, I think, will be something which will become more and more attractive over time.
So we just have a couple minutes left. I'd love for each of you to give one prognostication. It can be far in the future, it can be over the next year, but one thing that you think we're going to see with regard to the tokenization of assets at some point in the not too distant future. Caroline, why don't we start with you?
So look, my money is really on, some of these very short-term, the sort of stablecoin money market fund things, but at the other end of the spectrum, the digitally native assets. I think we're still quite a fair way because there's a lot of vested interest in not changing current systems in terms of the traditional financial markets, but some assets that perhaps don't have a well-established market so far, and that includes things sort of like the green asset space, but also digitally native assets are things we're going to see develop a lot quicker than we're going to see the switch over to, say, seeing New York Stock Exchange and markets like that operating with tokenized assets.
My prediction is that we will not see a revolution of the financial industry. Generally, the pattern that we're seeing is the same levels of intermediation of, say, a bond issuance. You've got the same participants, although you'll have interesting new functionalities through atomic settlement once you have a greater array of both government, like CBDC-backed stablecoins in particular. That said, while those structures and a lot of those existing operators will remain, I think that we'll start to see a greater proliferation and a greater variety of tokenized assets as we have more platforms that are able to distribute them, which is now what we're seeing through the regulated pathways coming forward from certain markets.
My prediction, and maybe it's a hope, is that a lot of regulations kind of do away with paper records, and that applies across so many different types of industries and really opens the door for digitally native records, which I think would drive tokenization for a lot more use cases.
So it might be a surprise to some, but I think that the major stablecoin issuers in Europe are going to be banks, the ones that are regulated in the future, in the next months. And I think that when it comes to tokenization, it's really important that there's liquidity. So those are going to be the successful use cases. We need a successful business use case in order to even go through all the struggle of compliance, etc. So I think we really need to think about where the liquidity is, and is there enough people that are interested in buying or selling or trading or even owning those assets.
Well, I promised you all another opportunity for a big yeehaw, so join me in a big yeehaw for our terrific panel. Yeehaw! Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Lou.